Okay, so that's the second step that I want to emphasize. There has to be something like a definition Socrates is after, and which Euthyphro agrees to try to resolve. And so that takes us to the third idea, or at least the third big move. Euthyphro offers another potential answer, and it's this kind of answer which he wants to retain in some sense throughout the rest of the dialogue. But he claims that, well, piety, more generally, piety is what is dear to the gods. And so there's some dialogue that occurs between Socrates and Euthyphro at this juncture. And Socrates asks, well, doesn't it seem as though the gods often act like men and women, in that they bicker and they get angry with each other, and they disagree about matters of the good and about matters of justice, about matters of what it's right to do? And doesn't this pose a problem, Euthyphro? Because here's how it goes. Isn't it the case that if the gods disagree about these matters, then it could be that, say, take one god, maybe it's Athena or Hera or Zeus or whoever. Maybe they call a certain action, like prosecuting one's own father. Maybe one of them suggests or thinks, or it's dear to them, that that action is right, that that action is dear to them. And yet another god does not think that that action is correct, thinks it's incorrect. It is not dear to them. And it seems as though if that's the case, and this is where it goes, in that case, the same object or the same action would be both dear and not dear to the gods. In other words, it would be both the right thing and not the right thing to do. And that seems as though it's a contradiction, because it can't be both dear and not dear to the gods. If we leave the idea of what piety is as being dear to the gods, it's in virtue of the fact that the gods disagree about actions that it produces a kind of contradiction, which then gives us no clear idea about what piety actually is. And so to bring that out a little further, I want to read the passage that this occurs. So if you turn to the reading, I'm going to use my book here. But if you look at the Greek pagination, and this is something I mentioned in the blog post, if you look at 7e in the Greek pagination, so 7e, and then going forward, this is what Socrates says. Then according to your argument, my good Euthyphro, different gods consider different things to be just, beautiful, ugly, good, and bad, for they would not be at odds with one another unless they differed about these subjects, would they? Euthyphro, you're right. Socrates, and they like what each of them considers beautiful, good, and just, and hate the opposites of these. Certainly. But you say that the same things are considered just by some gods and unjust by others. And as they dispute about these things, they are at odds and at war with each other. Is that not so? It is. The same things then are loved by the gods and hated by the gods. And we would be both God-loved and God-hated. It seems likely. And the same things would be both pious and impious, according to this argument. And Euthyphro says, I'm afraid so. And so, it's in virtue of this argument that it seems as though just being dear to the gods is insufficient for understanding what piety actually is. Okay, so that takes us to another proposal from Euthyphro. And what happens in this fourth move is that Euthyphro tries to suggest something. Well, even if it's the case that gods disagree and therefore it produces a contradiction, nonetheless, they would agree in this case that killing the servant in the way that his father did Well, that's unjust. There would be agreements about that particular action, he thinks, amongst all the gods. And there's a little prior discussion before this. They clarify that what they're after is not that, say, wrongdoers should be punished for their actions, which other philosophers actually might disagree with. But put that aside. They agree that wrongdoers should be punished for their actions, for their wrongdoing. But the real question they're after is, the real question that they are after is, what constitutes wrongdoing? What's the reason behind calling something a good, a bad, a right or a wrong, or a pious and or impious action? And so Euthyphro is trying to get by this concern about Socrates, about disagreement between the gods, says, maybe in this case, killing a servant in the way that it's been done, all the gods might agree that this is unjust. And now Socrates does something very important. And I mean that in a few ways. One is he finds a way to keep the dialogue going because he wants to investigate whether this idea is relevant. But argumentatively, what he does is really crucial. And this will not be the last time we see this kind of argumentative maneuver. Socrates grants an idea. What idea does he grant? That maybe all the gods agree that killing the servant in this case is unjust. But he's going to ask, even if that's true, even if that supposition is true, what does that really prove? Or what does that show? Does that really show us what the nature of piety is? And so granting an idea in this way can be important because sometimes people suggest an idea and they think that, well, the other idea that they're trying to show, namely that what piety is what all the gods would agree upon in this case as being pious, actually gives definition. But perhaps it doesn't support that. And so Socrates is going to try to undermine that idea. So just granting the supposition is the fourth large move. It's the fifth move, which is really the crux of the dialogue, all told. It's perhaps the most important and most emphasized part of the dialogue. And we can find it in the Greek pagination at 10a. So let me read that real quickly. So I'm going to start from 9d, roughly. Euthyphro says, I would certainly say that the pious is what all the gods love, and the opposite, what all the gods hate, is the impious. Socrates, then let us again examine whether that's a sound statement. Or do we let it pass? And if one of us, or someone else, merely says that something is so, do we accept that it is so? Or should we examine what the speaker means? Euthyphro, we must examine it. But I certainly think that this is now a fine statement. And now Socrates says, and this is 10a, we shall soon know better whether it is. Consider this. Is the pious being loved by the gods because it's pious? Or is it pious because it's being loved by the gods? So let me write that down. Is the pious being loved by the gods because it's pious? Or is it pious because it's being loved by the gods? Notice how these reasons are different. In the first instance, the gods are loving the pious because it's pious. In the second instance, that which is pious is so because it's being loved by the gods. And it's on Euthyphro's proposal, this second one, that what is pious, it just is what is dear to the gods. It's what all of them agree upon. It's what all of them happen to love. The Socrates becomes dissatisfied with the answer. And so one thing you might ask yourself is, how could you rephrase this to show why it is that Socrates thinks this answer is insufficient? I want to give a couple of ideas about why this answer seems insufficient to Socrates, or it might just seem unsatisfactory to us anyway. I want to do this in a few ways. I want to give a kind of answer to this which Socrates does not quite emphasize, but the others have emphasized, and then I will look at one of Socrates' answers. Suppose that the pious is what it is because it's being loved by the gods. It seems as though, if that's the case, then whatever is pious just happens. Just happens to be whatever the gods happen to love, or happen to will, or happen to deem what is right. And that seems a little unsatisfactory for the following reason. It seems as though, say, one day, the gods could say that one kind of action is pious, and then the next day turn back and say, no, that action is actually impious. We don't love that action anymore. Yeah, yesterday we all agreed, but today we disagree about, or we all agree that that is actually the wrong action. And then the following day they could reinstitute or reinstate that action as being the right kind of action, that all of a sudden is loved again. And it seems as though if whatever piety is just whatever happens to be loved by the gods, or whatever they happen to deem right, or to authorize as being correct, it leaves what is the right thing to do, or what piety is, it leaves it up to something which is just arbitrary. It's just at the gods' perhaps fickle will to say that an action is either pious or impious. And if it's arbitrary in this way, it seems as though there's no particularly good reason behind why an action is pious or impious. And if it's arbitrary in this way, we could imagine not only is it seemingly impossible to figure out what really is pious or impious, except for whatever the gods happen to think at a given time, it also makes us think that the gods aren't to be trusted in this way. If they can be so fickle about determining what really is pious or pious. Because maybe prosecuting one's own father is pious today, but wrong tomorrow. Or vice versa. And so there are different ways of stating that arbitrariness objection. But again, it leaves it up to whatever the gods happen to think at a given moment or a given time. And so part of what Socrates seems to be investigating, and this is the second point which goes along with this first point, is that if we were really to understand what piety is, piety would somehow have to be above whatever the gods happen to love. The gods would somehow have to subject themselves or be below the nature of the pious. That they would have to love it because it really is the pious, or because it really is the right thing to do. And so Euthyphro's answer seems to reverse this hierarchy in the wrong kind of way that leaves it up to something that would just be arbitrary. And so that's one major reason that Socrates or anybody else reading the dialogue could be unsatisfied with Euthyphro's proposal. There's a different kind of reason that Socrates offers, and I want to get at that in just a moment.